Good morning, Crossroads. So good to be with you. My name's Craig. I'm one of the pastors around here. And if you are in the building or out on the patio, welcome to campus. And if you're online, we're glad you are online. We are in a genealogy series where we are looking at some of these names, some of these people that show up at the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. As we look at the different genealogy, all these different names, what do they mean? Have you ever been so close to a particular family that you just were kind of part of the family? You ever had like that when maybe you were a kid? A friend of mine that I've befriended in recent years is someone that has become a very close friend of mine. And I met him actually when I was up in Northern California. His name's Bailey, and he's one of my closest friends. And I had to go back up there about a year ago for a wedding. I was invited to do a wedding for one of the guys that I worked with. He was a young youth pastor, and I had the opportunity to marry him and his wife. And when I went up there, I asked my friend Bailey, I said, hey, can I stay at your house while I come up for the wedding? And he was in the wedding, and so we were going to get to spend some good time together. And he goes, oh my gosh, of course. He goes, just let me know whatever you need. I said, well, would you be able to take me to like the rehearsal? Would you be able, like, do you have a room? Like anything. I'm great. I'll sleep on a couch, whatever. And he goes, oh, no. He goes, you're like family. He goes, I'm going to give you my car for the weekend. I'm going to give you my car. And he goes, and you can sleep in our guest bedroom. And you can actually, you don't need to come through the front door. You can come through the back door, right? You can come through the back door. You never have those people that leave the back door unlocked for you, right? You ever have those kind of people that they just trust you, right? I've seen a picture before of people that have different signs up in their backyard or something like that. And I remember this one sign that I saw and it said, backdoor guests are the best. And the people that are just close to you, right? People that are close to you because there's a great story there of how you built this relationship. Today, like you heard, we're talking about a man in the genealogy of Jesus, a man named Boaz. But in order to understand who Boaz is, we have to make sure that we can understand another family that shows up. Now, Boaz, of course, shows up in the genealogy of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, we read this. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. All right, pause. Some of you are thinking like, doesn't this guy know that that's pronounced salmon? Doesn't he know that? Doesn't that guy know that? And I have done extensive research here. And as hard as it was for me to just say salmon, that's how you pronounce it. That's how my English brain is needing to reject a fine, tasty fish here for a moment. Salmon was the father of Boaz. Now that we can move past that, who was the mother of Rahab? Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Now, as we dive deep and as we understand this story of Boaz, we have to talk about another family before we can actually get to the story of Boaz. The story that we're going to talk about is a couple that we read about in the book of Ruth. It's a couple, a married couple, a man by the name of Elimelech and a wife by the name of Naomi. And this shows up in the book of Ruth. Ruth is the 8th book of your Bible. It's the 8th book in the Old Testament. So if you go to the very beginning and you start going to your right a little bit, maybe go to, I don't know, maybe like a 10th of your Bible or an 8th of your Bible, you're going to land in this book of Ruth. It's 4 short chapters, but it's an incredibly powerful and wild story that we see of this particular family. Now, interestingly enough, where we have to understand a little bit deeper context is the story of God in the Old Testament is about his relationship with a chosen group of people, and they are the Jews. They are the Israelites. Now, the Israelites are undergoing a devastating time in their history. Now, you have to understand something about the God of the Old Testament is also the God of the New Testament and the God that we still serve today. But back then, God created covenants with his people. And there were unconditional covenants. There were also conditional covenants. So God would declare that if you do things the way that I want you to do them, for example, this would be like Mosaic law, the 10 commandments that Moses would get when he would go to the top. This is all confined to be and understood as a conditional covenant, meaning God said if you do these 10 things and you adhere to these rules, good things will come your way. However, if you don't obey me, if you don't do the things that I've asked you to do, then there are going to be curses upon you. And we go throughout Leviticus and we go throughout Deuteronomy and all throughout the first 5 books of the Old Testament, affectionately called the Torah in Jewish circles. It's these first 5 books, and it's filled with stories of where the Israelite people get it wrong, and there's opportunities where they experience curses, they experience the wrath of God, and then there's times where they do it right, and they experience the blessings of God. And this is what the Israelites, this is what their whole Old Testament journey is all about. It's this idea of one day they wake up and they make the right decision, and one day they wake up and they make the wrong decision. Man, I feel like that's still relevant for me today. That there's times where I wake up and I make the wrong decision, and there's times where I wake up and I make the right decision. But Israel is in the midst of a massive setback when we arrive at the book of Ruth in their particular history. 3 things are happening in their history. First, their land is not prosperous, nor is it fruitful. This would be the result of a curse. God said that if you don't obey me, under these conditional covenants, there will be famine in your land. And that's exactly what they're experiencing. Their land is not prosperous, nor is it fruitful. Number 2, they're in the middle of a famine. And number 3, tragedy, as a result, often struck people's families or people's lives because of this nation that is refusing to be obedient. Oftentimes it's, man, if we would just get it right, if there were times where we would just be obedient, sometimes that helps pave a little bit smoother of a path. Not always, but oftentimes I think about the things that happen in my life and how I would be so much better off if I would just do it God's way instead of trying to cling to something and do something my way because I think it's best. Refusing to agree to or understand that God's way is truly best. And so in Ruth chapter 1, we meet this family. And the nation of Israel is in this incredibly massive season of setback. And in Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we read this. It says, "In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land." We would understand just by reading that the judges didn't do a very good job. There's famine in the land, there's curse upon their land, and they're experiencing incredible heartache. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in a country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi, and their sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Now, I want to take a quick pause here. How many of you guys would say that you're a regular attender on our Wednesday night house of study when we come together and we're in here? For those of you that have never been to a Wednesday night is what we call our premier night of house of study, where we go a little bit deeper into something. Right now we're going through the book of James, and by the time we finish, it will have been 6 months that we go through, and we go nearly verse by verse. And what we do is we go. It's a little bit more of a deep dive. Today we're going to go through the entire book of Ruth, 4 chapters, which, by the way, if you really wanted to do a deep dive, this would be like an 8-week, a 10-week, a 12-week series where you could actually really deep dive. And I want to do just a very brief moment of a deep dive into this part of this passage right here. Names were incredibly significant in the Old Testament. Names meant something. If you were named something, it's because it was something that you were able to be identified by your name. Not just by your last name, right? But there was a characteristic or a trait or something that you have experienced where you were given that name. Now, there's oftentimes stories that we see pop up in the Old Testament where God actually changes people's names. Why? Because they walked through a season, and because their lives were transformed or marked by that season that they went through, God wanted them to remember, hey, I want you to remember how crucial this season was. So all of a sudden in these first 2 verses, we see 6 different names or significant things that pop up that's worth a little bit of a deep dive. And this is what our house of study on Wednesday night, by the way, if you've never been, and we invite you to come out, we do a deep dive, and it's incredibly powerful. For those of you that come, you know the power of Wednesday nights in truly taking a little bit deeper of a look because we spend a little bit more time being intentionally slower on Wednesday nights. Now, 6 different names of people and places that help us understand this story in a new light. Here's the 6 places or names that show up. We have Bethlehem, which in the Hebrew means house of bread. pretty ironic that the house of bread is experiencing a famine right now. At this point in the story, Judah, Bethlehem, in the region of Judah, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, means praise. Elimelech means my God is my king. Naomi means pleasant. Mahlon means sickly. And Chilion means pining, which means declining or wasting away. That's a tough name. If you are pregnant right now and you're undecided between names, I wouldn't go with Mahlon or Chilion. I don't think that you want your kids walking around and be like, yeah, my name means sickly. Yeah, that's just what it is. Yeah, my name means wasting away. I wouldn't recommend that. There might be better trends on TikTok for all I know. Who knows? But let's do something interesting. Let's reread these first two verses by inserting these meanings in place of the names. Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, here's the meaning of these names inserted for the names themselves. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from house of bread in praise, I feel like I'm reading one of those ad-libs right now. You know those like things where you're like, give me a noun, right? So it says, so a man from house of bread in praise left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was My God is my king, and his wife was pleasant. Their sons were sickly and pining. Now, we're going to go to a bunch of names, okay? All right? So that house of study moment, we do so much of that on Wednesday nights. We invite you to come. We're going to do there's a lot of names that we're going to hear about today. And so we thought it would be helpful to make our own little family tree. So here's our family of 4 right here. We've got Elimelech and Naomi. They are married, and they've got 2 sons. They've got Mahlon and Chilion, and they head to Moab. They leave their town of House of Bread in a land called Praise. Seems like a really rough choice to leave that. And they go to a Gentile nation that worships a false god. And actually this false god, his name is Chemosh, and the Bible described this false god as the abomination of Moab. You could imagine the pressure that this family is placing themselves in as they are experiencing now this big move as a family. And in Ruth chapter 1, I'm going to summarize this for you. They arrive in Moab, and shortly after they arrive in Moab, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, he dies. We read about, we don't know how he died, but he just died. Ruth's 2 sons, they would actually take Moabite women. They would each take a Moabite woman, and they would each marry this Moabite woman, which was strictly forbidden as the way that God would have intended for his people, to make sure that they married other Jewish people, because he didn't want the influence of these false gods from these other nations and their religion, their pure devotion to God be defiled, because you are going to another nation where false gods are being worshipped. But each of Naomi's sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they each take a wife for themselves. Chilion marries a woman named Orpah, and Mahlon marries a woman named Ruth. And now all of a sudden our family tree is updated, right? Elimelech, Naomi, Elimelech's gone. But Orpah is married to Chilion, Mahlon is married to Ruth. And the tragedy is only beginning for this family here. Within 10 years, both of Naomi's son, sickly and pining, they die. Which honestly, knowing with those 2 names, and that's probably something that they wrestled with and that they dealt with for a very long time, they died. Leaving all the men dead, and now all of a sudden you've got 3 widows. The family tree has been literally chopped in half. Elimelech is dead, Mahlon is dead, Chilion is dead. And now all of a sudden you've got these 3 widows that are literally facing the absolute worst kind of future that anybody during that particular time could have faced. You could not have had more of a brutal future in your life if you were a childless widow. And this was the devastation. This was the grim future that each of these women faced. News would eventually get to Naomi, and they would find out that apparently Israel is probably being obedient to God yet again, and all of a sudden the famine leaves, and there's incredible blessing that's happening in Israel, and the land is discovered to be prosperous again. So Naomi wants to leave Moab and head back to Bethlehem. And as she does, she looks at her two daughters-in-law and she says, "You don't want this future. You do not want this future. In fact, what you should do is you should both go back to your families. We're here in your home country. Don't leave with me. Don't come to a foreign nation. And just stay with your families. You have no future with me." And in Ruth chapter 1, verses 14 through 18, we see this incredible moment, and you can feel the tears, and you can feel the angst, and you can feel the sorrow that's happening. It says this, "Again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. 'Look,' Naomi said to her, 'your sister-in-law has gone back to be with her gods, and you should do the same.'" So Orpah hears this message from Ruth, and she's like, "All right, I'll go back to my family. I don't want to have this grim future, this devastated future that awaits me. I'll go back to my family for sure." But Ruth, she cleaves, she hangs on to, she clings to Naomi. Verse 16, "But Ruth replied, 'Do not ask me to leave you again and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God.'" You understand how incredible this is? This woman grew up in a nation that didn't know who the one true God was. They worshiped a false God. And all of a sudden, you've got Naomi and this family, and they come over, and she meets them, and she must have seen something incredible happening in their family, despite the traumatic situation that might have been going on, before all of the death may have occurred. And all of a sudden, she says, "Naomi, I want the God that you have. I want the servitude that you have for your God. I want to serve that same God. I want that God to be the God of my life." I wonder if the example that we set in our lives is such that people see the way that we conduct our lives. People hear about the words that we speak, and all of a sudden people are like, "I want the God that you have. I want the God that you serve." And this is Ruth's proclamation. She says, "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Verse 17, "Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she didn't say anything else. She wasn't going to try to appeal to Ruth and say, "You should just stay." So Naomi and Ruth, they returned to Bethlehem, and it happens to be at the beginning of this spring barley harvest. And when they return, there's a little bit of a homecoming. There's this talk in the town that all of a sudden Ruth, Naomi and Elimelech, this family is coming back. But all of a sudden they look, and when they left, it was Naomi with her husband Elimelech and their two sons. And when they come back, none of the men are there. In fact, Naomi shows up with this daughter-in-law, and it's just them. And there's a bit of a homecoming that happens. Ruth chapter 1, verses 19 to 21, it says, "Is it really Naomi?" the women asked. "Is it really her?" And then look at what Naomi says in verse 20. "Don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant any longer. Don't do it. Instead, call me Mara." Mara means bitter. Don't call me pleasant anymore. Call me bitter. "For the Almighty has made my life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me?" There's something about pain and heartache and tragedy and hopelessness that has taken its toll on Naomi. And in our world today, it feels like there's times where we turn in situations where we see the other side of something and we experience the pain and the heartache and the tragedy and this continuous beatdown of this hopelessness that sometimes happen. Maybe you can relate to that. Maybe you just recently got laid off from your dream job that you had, that you thought, "Man, if I could just get this job, then I will truly be happy. Maybe if I finally get this job, I will finally be pleasant." Maybe your marriage of 20 plus years just ended abruptly. Just like that. And you're trying to pick up the pieces, and you're trying to figure out what's next, and you never saw it coming. Maybe you had to say goodbye to a loved one far too soon. And you look at the circumstances of life and you think, man, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, life was pleasant, but now I feel like my circumstances are bitter. But sometimes God brings the unexpected to undo the unending and unbearable pain that exists in our life. Sometimes that happens. Oftentimes we don't see it happening because sometimes we're so focused on it. This is where we jump into Ruth chapter 2. We meet a man named Boaz. And Boaz appears, and he doesn't have any tie to this family yet, but we're going to go ahead and put him up into the family tree. And he is there. Of course, he is the son of Salmon there. In Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, we meet Boaz. It says this: "Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech." Now, this is the very first sentence that we read about Boaz. The author of Ruth, whom we do not know for sure who it is, mentions this extremely important fact. There is a familial relationship that exists between Boaz and Naomi/Ruth. There's family ties here through Elimelech that Boaz has this, there's kin there, there's blood relation there. And this is an important fact. Put a pin in that. We're going to come back to that in just a little bit. Now, Boaz was a field owner. He owned crops. He was wealthy. He was influential. And this was what he experienced. And as a field owner, someone that owned crops, Boaz was bound by law to make sure that he left some of his crops on the edges of his fields, that he would leave those for widows, that he would leave those for foreigners, that he would leave those for people that were destitute. This was the law. This is what was required. And so Boaz, who was a wealthy and influential man, was about doing the right thing. And of course, he would do this. In fact, here's the law that speaks of that. In Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 through 10, it says this: "When you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your field, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. It is the same with your grape crop. Do not strip every last bunch of grapes from the vines, and do not pick up the grapes that fall to the ground. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God." Now, here's what Ruth's future was all about. You ready? Ruth's future was all based on people who owned land, like Boaz, living by Leviticus chapter 19. If Ruth wanted to eat, this is what she had to do. If Ruth wanted to survive, this is what her future looked like. Naomi knew that. That's why she told her daughters-in-law before they left Moab, you don't want this future for yourself. Stay in your land so you don't have to do any of this stuff. Your families will be able to take care of you. Her as a widow couldn't do anything. So Ruth shows up to Bethlehem, and she knows what her widowed rights are. So what does she do? She heads to the fields. This is what her future, this was her destiny now. This was her fate. A cruel twist of once being married, not being able to have a son, her husband now dying, all of the men in this family tree now dying. This is what Ruth had to look forward to. So the way that they would go is they would show up in the fields, and they would just pick a random field, and they would show up, and it was this process called gleaning. And they would go and they would glean the fields, and there would be food that would fall. The harvesters would come. They would drop the food. Harvesters weren't supposed to go back and pick up the food. They just left it there. The corners of the field, everything would stay on the branches or on the vines, and everything would stay as is. And then the foreigners and the people who were less fortunate would come through, and they would be able to make a living. They would be able to survive. Hardly making a living, but they would be able to survive. And it would just so happen that Ruth shows up in the field of Boaz. And in Ruth chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, it says this: Boaz and Ruth have this interaction, and Boaz says, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field that they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water that they have drawn at the well." If you skip down a few verses, verses 14, it continues. At mealtime, Boaz called to her and said, "Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine." So she sat with his harvesters, And Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all that she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, hey, let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up. Don't give her a hard time. Everything that we just read right there, Boaz didn't have to do. He didn't have to do any of that. Right? All he had to do was just leave the fields untouched on the corners. And his harvesters knew that if you dropped something, of course it was all dropped by accident, but it was surely to happen, that you just left it there. And here's Boaz saying, no. Stay in my fields. I'm going to tell my workers to not be harsh with you. I'm going to tell my harvesters to make sure that when they go through, that they're accidentally dropping these things, right? Just drop it on purpose. Oops. I did a wedding yesterday, and the flower girl comes down. The flower girl has an important job, everybody. The flower girl sometimes accidentally drops all the flowers in one spot, but every time they walk down, they are purposefully emptying their basket. Such a cute moment. So this little flower girl, she's at this wedding yesterday. She comes down, she sits in the front row. I'm not kidding, I've never seen this happen before. She sits in the front row, and 5 minutes into the ceremony, she comes back up to the front, standing there, and she has more flowers in her basket. So she drops them in the middle, and I was like, okay, yeah, come on, you got more flowers, you got work to do. She's dropping I was like, and now the basket is empty, right? Boaz is saying, you got to do the same thing, guys. Just drop some on purpose. Oops, we dropped some of the grain. Oops, this is what he's describing. There's some things that we can learn from Boaz. There's some things that we can learn that we can apply today. Number one, it's this: Boaz went above and beyond. Boaz didn't just do the minimum. Boaz was gracious, he was generous, he was helpful, and because of all of that, hope began to spring up. Are you a person that just does the minimum? I know school is beginning to end, and we've got finals coming, right? I see some head nodding from our students. Are you some that just doing the minimum to get by? That's a good question, because I know that because I've done the minimum before. Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 to 25 says this: servants, do what you're told by your earthly masters, and don't just do the minimum that will get you by. Do your best. Work from the heart for your real master, for God, confident that you'll get paid in full when you come into your inheritance. Keep in mind always that the ultimate master that you're serving is Christ. The sullen servant, the lazy servant who does shoddy work will be held responsible. Being a follower of Jesus doesn't cover up bad work. Don't just do the minimum. Don't just do the minimum. You know what's incredible, though, about this church? I feel like this is a church that doesn't do the minimum. I feel like we are a group of people, that we are a community of believers, that we don't just do the minimum around here. Yeah, praise God. And you can give yourself a clap on the back. You can give yourself a little pat on the back there. We do a thing here, if you're brand new, we do a little thing called Boldly Bless around here. And we do seasons of it where we spend several weeks looking for opportunities to bless somebody tangibly in our community. This idea that we would walk through the fields and oops, we accidentally drop something for somebody to be blessed by. Because we ask all of Crossroads during this Boldly Blessed season, we're not in it today. If you want to give $1 extra, you can. But we're not in the season right now, but we ask everybody to give $1 extra on top of your normal tithe. $1. And then we take the attendance of the weekend, and we take that and we match that person per dollar, and then we go and we bless somebody. Why? Because we believe, praise the Lord, we believe that we are not just called to do the minimum. We are called to go above and beyond. You see, Boaz's intention was to serve God. That was his goal. My goal is to go serve God. And it wasn't to get all these blessings. It's because he wanted to put God first in everything. And I believe that that's a great question for us to answer today, that you sit with. What is my motivation for going above and beyond in certain ways? Is because I think I might get ahead in another way? No, it's because our motivation is to serve and love God and to be obedient to him. Now, Boaz he intends on helping Ruth. Now, Go back to that key detail at the very beginning of Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. We understand that Boaz is a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. Now, there was another law that existed in that time. It was a Levitical law that contained a rule about redeeming property for somebody, a family member, who had fallen on hard times. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 25 says, if one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell some family land, then a close relative should buy it back for him. This is what was expected. And so all of a sudden, these close family ties, or maybe not close family ties, but distant family ties, they became relevant. Which is why this author is making this point that he wants us to understand that, guess what? Boaz is going to have an opportunity to redeem some land for these widows. Why? Because he's family. Now, in Deuteronomy, there was another law that required yet another act of redeeming another person. In Deuteronomy 25, it actually speaks of a close relative marrying a childless widow, thus perpetuating the family name while keeping the land in the family. High honor culture, incredibly high honor culture, and God set it up that way so that people would be able to honor people really, really well. And Boaz was more than willing to do this. But remember, this is a man that goes above and beyond. In Ruth chapter 3, Boaz learns that there's another person in that area that is actually a closer relative to Ruth. And check out this exchange that he has. He says this. Ruth chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. It says, but while it's true, he's speaking to Ruth, while it's true that I'm one of your family redeemers, there's another man who is more closely related to you than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning I will talk to him, and if he's willing to redeem you, very well, let him marry you. But if he's not willing, then surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you myself. This is Boaz's proclamation, his promise to Ruth. We now come face to face with a second thing that we can learn from Boaz. Number 2, Boaz chose the right thing rather than the easy thing. He chose the right thing rather than the easy thing. For us, rarely do those two things end up being the exact same thing. Most of the time, the thing that's not the right thing is actually the easier thing. And so we have to come face to face, I'll say daily. Sometimes moment by moment, will we choose the easy route or will we choose the right route? You see, Boaz is faced with this. And before he even knows, he hasn't even talked to this other kinsman redeemer, this idea that can redeem this family member. That's what a kinsman redeemer means. It means this family member that can come and help redeem the land, but also redeem the family name to help carry it on. Boaz hasn't even had a conversation with it yet. It's not like he's like, oh, I already know he's going to say yes, so I'm going to be able to save some money and save some inheritance for some future kids. I'm good. I already know he's going to say yes. He didn't know what was going to happen. Why? Why would he go do this? Because Boaz not only went above and beyond, but Boaz was always willing to do the right thing rather than do the easy thing. And so, the next day, he calls over this next of kin that would be first in line, given the opportunity to buy this piece of land. And so when he calls him over in Ruth chapter 4, he calls him over and he goes, hey, you're next in line. You're the first person. You've got the first right of refusal to this piece of land right here. You can buy that and you can help redeem this piece of land, which, by the way, would have been a great investment for this guy. I get to own another piece of land and I get to do it on behalf of a family member? Great. That's what Leviticus talks about. But I love what Boaz does here because Boaz forces this guy to come face to face with, hey, dude. I just said dude because his name's not in there. Hey, dude. Or bro, whatever you want. Are you going to do the right thing or do you want to do the easy thing? Check out what happens. Boaz told him, of course your purchase of the, Ruth chapter 4, verse 5, Boaz says, of course your purchase of the land from Naomi also requires you to marry Ruth, the Moabite widow. That way she can have children who can carry on her husband's name and keep the land in the family. So it's not just the land here, it's actually the person that needs to be redeemed. And what happens is this. The man responds, and he says, oh, I couldn't do that. And this is what he cites. He says, I've got my inheritance all figured out for my sons, and if I marry this woman, and my intention now is to help carry on her family name, and she has a son, it's going to complicate all of my inheritance. This man had the opportunity to go do the right thing. What did he choose? Chose the easy thing. So he says, I can't do it. It's not for me. It's going to make my life more difficult, which, by the way, every time, almost every time that we choose to do the right thing rather than the easy thing, it makes our life complicated, doesn't it? It complicates our life. Oh man, it'd be so much easier to do the easy thing. This person doesn't even know that I am just seething mad with them, because every time I see them, I just put on this face. I'm like, hey, how's it going? And inside I'm like, you're a jerk. You don't have to say anything. That'd be the easy thing to do. The right thing would be, man, I need to talk to you about something. I've held this bitterness and resentment towards you. Some of it might even go a little bit deeper. My wife would never know about the conversations that I'm having at work. My wife would never find out about that. Why would I come clean? That would only complicate things. I'm just going to choose the easy thing as opposed to the right thing. Let me tell you, as a person that in college, when I hung on to things that I knew that I needed to come clean to other people about, ways that I had harmed other people that nobody would have ever had known, I would have taken those things to the grave. It was the guilt and shame that just wore me down. And it forced me into, praise God it did, it forced me into making the right decision as opposed to just making the easy decision. You see, we are faced daily with this opportunity to choose the easy thing rather than the right thing. So Boaz cements this thing. And in Ruth chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, he says, Then Boaz said to the elders and the crowd standing around you, You are witnesses today that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon, and with the land I have acquired Ruth, the Moabite widow of Mahlon, to be my wife. This way she can have a son to carry on the family of her dead husband and inherit the family property here in this hometown. You are all witnesses today. And it would be in this moment that Boaz would ink his name in the lineage of Jesus, because he would marry Ruth and they would have a son together, and that son would be Obed. Obed would have a son. His name would be Jesse, and Jesse would have a son, and his name would be David. Ruth and Boaz were the great-grandparents of King David. The same Goliath-killing kid who herded sheep. This guy. You see, the lineage of Jesus would pass through Ruth and Boaz. Now, here's what you need to realize. Boaz didn't know that Jesus was going to pass through his lineage. It wasn't like an angel came to Boaz and was like, hey, you should do this thing that's going to happen over these next few weeks because your name's going to show up in a book years later. And there's going to be this message that's going to get preached to you the week after Mother's Day in 2024 in Corona. Boaz wasn't like, oh, sign me up. You see, Boaz, he left a legacy. But he didn't know what kind of legacy he was leaving. But you want to know how he was able to leave a legacy? It's because he started living his legacy. And for you and I today, that's what we're faced with. Yeah, we want to leave a legacy. Yeah, we want to leave things better or more improved than how we found them, right? We want to leave this earth maybe in the best way possible. But oftentimes, we just want to get to the end without putting in all of the work right now. If you want to leave a legacy, we need to start living our legacy, which requires us to make sure that we go above and beyond. It requires us to make sure that we choose to do the right thing rather than do the easy thing. Are you willing to start living your legacy? And maybe you're sitting there today and you're like, I don't even know how to start living my legacy. Wouldn't even know where to begin. Pastor Chuck talked about in his communion meditation this idea that in the Old Testament and throughout Scripture, there's things called the typology of Christ. There's types of Christ. There's types of experiences that help us understand. And in some cases, they help foreshadow what's coming. Boaz was a type of Christ. And that Boaz came into an incredibly hopeless situation, and he chose to humble himself, and he chose to go do the right thing rather than the easy thing, and he chose to do something that would require the most sacrifice that he could have experienced. And if you're wondering how that is like Christ, it's exactly like Christ. Because Jesus would come down to this earth. He would choose to be like us. He would be fully God, but he would also be fully human. We see that God, through Jesus experienced every kind of temptation that you and I face. That's what Hebrews 4:15 says. That Jesus would endure suffering on our behalf. And he would willingly go to a cross. He wasn't forced into this thing. He wasn't forced into going to a cross and dying a cruel death. Look at what John chapter 10, verse 18 says. These are the words of Jesus. He says, "No one can take my life from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily. For I have the authority to lay it down when I want to, and also take it up again, for this is what my Father has commanded." Jesus chose, we all know that Jesus left a legacy, but you want to know how he was able to leave a legacy? It's because he lived his legacy. He knew what laid before him. He knew what the right choice was rather than embracing what the easy choice was. The easy choice would have said, God, I don't want the cross. I don't want to die for them. I don't want to endure that pain and suffering. Forget that. That was the easy thing. Jesus chose the right thing. Why? Because Jesus cared about his relationship with his Father that much. And he did it, caring for that relationship, thinking of you and I, thinking about how ourselves, our lives would need to be redeemed. You see, Boaz redeemed Ruth's hopeless situation, but when Jesus came to this earth and did what he did, he redeemed our hopeless situation. He redeemed your very personal hopeless situation, which means if you've walked in here today and hopelessness is the definition of your life right now, I have the best news that you ever could have imagined. There's hope, and you have been redeemed because of what Christ did on your behalf, and there's nothing that you could do to ever earn that. Jesus willfully, by his choice, because he wanted to do the right thing rather than the easy thing, chose to redeem you so that he could be in relationship with you. And that's the best news that you could ever hear. And so my question for you is, do you need to say yes to this sacrifice that Jesus paid on your behalf? You see, another thing that Boaz did was he redeemed it all, and he paid the full price. He wasn't just half in like the other guy was. He said, if I'm going all in, I'm going all in. Jesus did the exact same thing. He didn't go half in for us. He went all in, and he gave his life, the ultimate sacrifice. And maybe it's that sacrifice that you need to say yes to today. Maybe it's that sacrifice and that love. Maybe there is no other kind of love that you could ever experience, but maybe you've been wondering, is there another kind of love that would be able to make me feel whole again? There never will be unless you embrace the love of Jesus. Around here, we respond to Jesus by praying a prayer. And in just a moment, I'm going to lead you through that prayer if you want to say yes to him, if you want to be redeemed by him today, if you want to grab onto that love and that forgiveness that he has for you and recognize that he came to completely redeem you. And we'll pray a prayer. This prayer is